Hello, my name is Alistair Hobday. I'm based in Hobart, Tasmania, Australia, and this presentation is to describe in general terms how fish habitat forecasting can be used in fisheries management. In this 20 or 25-minute presentation, I'll describe habitat models, talk about what variables are commonly used in fish habitat models, provide some examples of forecasting applications at a range of timescales, discuss what makes a good data stream for these applications, and end with some of the challenges with forecasting fish habitat into the future. We already know that long-term climate risk is impacting on marine fisheries and aquaculture, collectively the seafood sector. There's evidence from around the world, including range changes with species moving south in Australia. It would be north in the northern hemisphere. There can be changes in growth. They can be positive. Under warmer temperatures, animals might grow faster and recruitment might be enhanced. Fish growth rates also respond to temperature and productivity changes. Increased heating of the climate system may increase upwelling in some areas of the ocean, which will increase productivity. But unfortunately, things like disease do better in warmer waters. We're seeing extreme events such as storms increase, marine heat waves, and so on, and all of these things collectively present a long-term risk to the seafood sector. This necessitates some prediction and forecasting. But this long-term trend in environmental conditions, for example, ocean temperature, is not the only reason that prediction and forecasting is useful. While there's a long-term trend indicated by this dotted line, short-term events, extreme events like heat waves or storms, also lead to stress on the environmental system. And we're seeing more and more stressful events as the climate system warms. The research that I can tell you about today involves a wide range of collaborators in Australia. We have fisheries oceanographers, we have biologists, we have fishery scientists. And we have close to 10 or so applications where we've been delivering forecasting for marine species around Australia. The kind of variables that we use in those forecasts include things like rainfall and air temperature for prawns, sea surface temperature and chlorophyll for southern bluefin tuna in the Great Australia Bight. And these colours of the map indicate wild fisheries, which are in grey coloured, aquaculture in pink, and recreational fisheries in light blue, and then inshore aquaculture in darker blue. So applications across the wide range of fisheries, commercial, recreational, and then aquaculture. The reason that we think we've been successful in Australia with seasonal forecasting is that managers, which are examples of stakeholders, and fishers have had some preconditioning. That means they've already experienced shocks in the environment where their historical experience was no longer sufficient to help them manage into the future. So these novel conditions experienced around the Australian coastline have been a real wake-up call. We've also been doing real-time habitat forecasting since 2003 for southern bluefin tuna on the east coast of Australia. And finally, we have a mature ocean forecast model through our collaborators at the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia that means that we can now make projections into the future. Our project team has been working together for a long time, and so the trust and knowledge in the domain is solid, and we have a good sense of how stakeholders might use these models in their decision making. We get that because we often include end users on the project teams so that they're seeing the development of a forecast and providing feedback as you go. In general, when we're developing habitat forecasts, we operate in 3 stages. The first stage is to assess the needs of the forecast. That includes discussions with industry or management. It means thinking about the timescales on which the forecast has to take place and what are the most likely variables that we would use in the habitat model. And finally, we like to assess what data there is to check whether the model is performing satisfactorily. In contrast to making a projection for the year 2100, when you do short-term forecasts 2 or 3 months ahead, it's very easy to tell whether your model is working satisfactorily, and we try and collect that data as we go. We then develop a model, and that includes assessing the skill using a hindcast to see how the model would have performed historically. Then we produce habitat distributions and forecasts and turn them into forecast products. The third stage is implementation, and that's working out how you're going to deliver a forecast to a fishery manager, for example, how you work with them to explain the weaknesses in a forecast, the strengths, and how to interpret the uncertainty. And finally, we have a pretty good view of how the end user decision is reached because we are being engaged with them all the way along. And there's feedback between the implementation and the development stage in a process of continual improvement. So how do you do habitat mapping? There are four main classes that I think can be used to make a habitat map. The first one is just to draw a circle around all the places that you've observed your fish in the ocean. And that's often used in museums as to describe the location of a fish. Similarly, you can use expert-based methods, which just use museum records, a knowledge of terrestrial or coastal habitats, and then make an expert-based assessment of where a fish habitat would occur. I've been more commonly using methods in group 3, which is statistical environmental models. And they can be variously called envelope models, quotient-based models, environmental niche models, regression trees, general linear models, and so on. And more advanced than this are mechanistic models, which use more than environmental variables to predict fish habitat. They might use prey fields or the behavioural rules of the fish. And Patrick Lahode will cover the Sepidine model in one of the presentations in this session. Another in that group is called apicosm. So a whole range of methods. And so the challenge is choosing the appropriate method for the question at hand. So here's one example that's been performed in the North Atlantic Ocean to look at the Atlantic bluefin tuna's potential habitat. And on the right-hand side, you can see a distribution that's predicted for July to September, with the yellow colour indicating high probability of suitable habitat for feeding and the blue colours indicating low probability. And interestingly, you can see a connectivity pathway between the east coast of the United States and the western part of Europe that indicates fish might migrate across the pathway. And in this analysis, the team on the left-hand side first understood the ecological relationship with the environment of the species in interest, collected their data, did a statistical analysis, and produced an environmental niche model, one of the examples I showed on the previous page. So these habitat models have a wide use in management. Fisheries managers use them to plan where they might send observers to collect information on bycatch. They can be used in spatial planning for deciding where particular areas might be included in or outside marine protected areas. Dynamic ocean management is one way of updating forecasts very rapidly to decide when you might prevent ships from travelling too fast in case they were going to hit a whale. Not really a fish, but a whale habitat model. And then finally, running multiple habitat models together can allow you to explore multi-species interactions. And EcoCast on the west coast of the United States is one of these examples. And depending on the question that you have, the timescale might be for historical description, real time, seasonal of up to 3 or 4 months ahead of time, or decades to centennial scale forecasting. And a wide range of variables get used in these models. Examples of these variables include 3 groups: primary variables, which are directly observed, secondary variables, which have got to be inferred from some signal, and then a third category called derived, where you use several layers to work out what the variable is. And so temperature is an example of a primary variable, chlorophyll is an example of a secondary variable, and eddies, which come from sea surface height anomaly, can be described and given an age and some other characteristics that make them a derived variable. Typically, the variables can be describing the environment at the surface or in the water column. And surface variables like temperature, ocean color, and so on are typically able to be gathered from observations. Some of them, like salinity, are typically coming more from climatologies, which is the average expected at that time of year. You notice that in the water column, it's very difficult to get observations of all of those that are gridded and available at all time periods. And so typically those water column variables have come from climatologies in the past or are derived from models. The BGC Argo array, though, offers you the opportunity to get some of these things in near real time in the water column. So which variable would you choose to make a habitat model? No matter which variable you choose, there's an assumption that the performance or the desirability of an area for a fish is related to the value of that variable. In this case, the performance of a fish increases with temperature to some optimum and then decreases. This might be a relationship for chlorophyll, for sea surface height, for temperature at depth. But you use these multiple relationships then to form a multi-variable view of where the suitable environment is. But the distribution of an animal is not only the function of the environment, but also its behavior, its life stage, or its evolution. So including environment only in models won't give a perfect result. So some examples. We have a project on the east coast of Australia that's trying to forecast changes in fish distribution for 5 major pelagic species, 3 tunas and 2 billfish, striped marlin and swordfish. And we're trying to develop predictive models at seasonal and decadal timescales and then provide these as operational forecasts. An example of an envelope method is just taking a set of observations and then drawing boundaries around those and looking at where habitat might shift in future. And so some early work that I did in Australia showed that for 11 species in longline fisheries, the observed habitat was likely to shift further south in the future under climate change. Again, here's an example of environmental niche model, which just is built on the premise that the suitable habitat is a relationship between environmental variable number 1, number 2, and number 3, and so on. And by combining those variables, you can come up with a niche model. And they have been used for zoning fisheries or looking at where you might go and collect samples. I think I'm up to the 4th type of analysis, is called quotient analysis. And we've used these in southern Australia to help fishermen decide where they would need to go to catch fish under quota. In the left-hand side shows the preferred distribution of temperature, and on the y-axis is the preferred distribution of chlorophyll. And there's a correlation between those two variables that suggests that the optimum temperature and chlorophyll combination for this fish is somewhere around 20 degrees and at a value of -2 log chlorophyll units, as indicated by the dark brown colour. You then project that preference onto a map of the ocean, which is shown in the right-hand side. And in this case, the preferred area is bone coloured and the non-preferred area is blue. And this has been validated with sightings of tuna in this particular month, which were all inside the area where we suggested the fish would be observed. Here's an example of a habitat preference model that's based on catch per unit effort data. And by looking at the preferred location for the fish in the middle bar graph, divided by the observed ocean conditions, we can tell whether or not the fish is choosing to occupy some areas more than others. And an example of a habitat map is shown on the left-hand side. Generalized linear models can also be used to generate habitat maps. In the first panel of figures is bathymetry, chlorophyll, sea surface temperature, ocean velocity, and mixed layer depth. And you can see the relationship with the tuna species there. And then we project those down to make a habitat probability in 2 example months in the lower figures. Areas of red colour indicate high likelihood of tuna, areas of blue indicate low likelihood, and the observations for that month are indicated by the size of the circles. The larger circle shows more fish were captured by fishermen the small circles less captured. Because we have both observations and predictions, we can evaluate habitat model performance. And for example, you can test alternative models or alternative variables and look at which combination of variables gives you the best model performance. And that's really best practice to be able to test the performance of your model. So which environmental variables work best? In general, the performance of a model, how much variance can be explained, increases with the number of variables that you include in the model. But the performance starts to asymptote after around 5 or 6 variables, and that's well before a perfect forecast. Hopefully it's more than you need for at least some sensible forecast, but below the useless for forecasting threshold, we just can't explain enough variance in the model. But adding more and more variables doesn't necessarily mean that you will get to perfect. If you did get to perfect, then your distribution would be explained entirely by the environment. That's unlikely, because the distribution is related to other things besides the environment, such as prey, behaviour, life stage and evolution. So our hope is we can improve models not by adding more surface variables, but by including subsurface variables or prey or other things to improve model performance. So what's the future of habitat mapping for fisheries? In order to be able to make future forecasts at seasonal, decadal or climate scales, you need models that can give you those variables. In order to do that, there are a whole number of steps that you must go to, including upload and processing and delivery, decision making and implementation. So it's a reasonably complicated set of steps, but the power of computing means that you can automate many of these steps now and run very fast once you collect the data. For example, in the east coast of Australia since 2003, we've been using data collected from electronic tags on fish that are gathered in a database, and they tell us about the observed temperature preference by depth. We then search a real-time ocean model for the distribution of those temperatures, convert them across all depths into a vertically integrated habitat prediction model shown in the upper right-hand side. Again, green is the location of no tuna, red is the expected location, and orange is the intermediate location. And we were delivering those to the Fisheries Management Agency every 2 weeks. That was turning these into management boundaries to limit the fisher activity in the region. Another example is in the Great Australia Bight of Southern Australia, where we are forecasting up to 2 months ahead of time the distribution of likely tuna habitat. On the right-hand side is those forecasts into the future, and you can see the spatial scale is quite blocky. These are half-degree resolution models. So if you're going to forecast into the future, again, here's a set of surface variables or variables at depth. And if I was able to build a historical model, maybe all of those variables are available and I can explain 50% of the distribution with one of these models. When I go to the conditions that I need 5 months into the future, that temperature's got to come from a ocean model. The energy kinetic energy, or EKE, has got to come from the ocean model. And not all of the variables can be available. And so your explanatory power will be weaker because you will use less variables. And so the explanatory power will be less than your historical model. It may be so much less that the performance of the forecast is really weak. So engagement really matters when you're working with forecasting models. You need to work closely with fisheries, the managers or the fishermen themselves, and be prepared to adapt as you go. It's clear from our experience there are a wide range of uses for habitat forecasts, and we deliver those in a range of ways. For example, websites can be automated to update daily maps. We could provide regular engagement through this method, and we updated a website in response to feedback and included much more than the forecasts. That's an open access site that you can check what's on there as illustration of a forecast. Here's an example of what that website shows. which is maps of recent temperature and chlorophyll conditions, some background on how we calculate the habitat preference, forecasts of up to 2 months into the future, and in the lower right-hand side, some case studies of recent seasons, because fishers will often want to know how the model would have performed in a year that they understand very well. A website is just one way of delivering the output. Our team in Australia uses websites, emails, summary sheets, primary publications, industry meetings, and traditional scientific conferences. And depending on the end user, one of those is more appropriate than another. In summary, forecasting fish habitat has a wide range of uses in fisheries management, policy, and even in catching fish. A habitat forecast might help improve economic efficiency if it's a quota managed fishery. In general, environmental associations between fish and, say, temperature are generally weak, and so prediction power is often poor, and that's because multiple factors are at play. Fish don't eat temperature, they also respond to a range of other things. There are really lots of model options for making a habitat model, and I have to say making a habitat model is now easy, particularly in calculating habitat suitability, but that doesn't translate into fish abundance. That's a hard step to make. In predicting into the future, because of climate change, the ocean is changing very rapidly. It's a non-stationary environment. And so out of sample prediction is a statistical no-no, yet that's what we're doing when we're forecasting into unique conditions. And so I think be careful about how challenging that out of sample prediction might be. And finally, validation of forecasting fish habitat is very important. And short-term forecasts 2 weeks or several months into the future really help you get some very rapid feedback in terms of improving your model. I think the future's really very bright with uses for fish habitat forecasting, and the extra data that might come from arrays of floats that are capturing subsurface variables will offer a step change in our ability to forecast the environment that fish are really using, not just surface variables, but subsurface variables. Thank you.